Hey everyone, Teacher Chang here, and today we are going to make perfect square trinomials by completing the square. Now, we create perfect square trinomials simply to make things a little bit easier when it comes to solving them. But before we do that, let's go ahead and learn how to create that perfect square trinomial. So the first thing that we have here is part of our trinomial, and we have x squared plus 8x plus some number. So we want to figure out, well, what is that last number, that c value, in order to make it a perfect square trinomial. So we're going to be using this rule here on the left where it says find b over 2 squared. And our b value in this particular case is going to be 8. So if I go ahead and substitute that 8 into that formula, b over 2 squared, well, that just means 8 over 2 squared. Well, 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. Now what that means is that 16, if I place that 16 right over here for c, well, that is going to give you a perfect square trinomial. Now, we do know that over here on the left, we can see that a perfect square trinomial has these formats, a squared plus 2ab plus b squared, and it's going to give you that factored form of a plus b squared. And we also have the same thing underneath, a squared minus 2ab plus b squared is going to give you a minus b squared in factored form. So if I wanted to factor this out, if I wanted to go ahead and figure out, well, what is our factored form of x squared plus 8x plus 16? Well, let me write it out. X squared plus 8x plus 16. Well, in factored form, we learned in the past that all you got to do, since we now know this is a perfect square trinomial, you just need to square root the first term, which is x, square root that last term, which is our 4, and then you take the sign in the middle, which is a plus sign, and all you got to do is square it because it's a perfect square trinomial. So now we have it in that factored form. Well, we're going to be using this to help us solve equations in a bit, but before we do that, let's go ahead and try some more. So here we got another one. It's a squared minus 12a plus some c value. And we want to know, well, what is that c value in order to make it a perfect square trinomial? So we're going to do the same thing, except this time b is equal to negative 12. So that means if I put it into our rule, b over 2 squared, well, that means negative 12 divided by 2, and we're going to square it. Well, negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6, and negative 6 squared is going to give me positive 36. So that means c is going to be 36. So I'm just going to take that 36, plug it in for c, and now we have a perfect square trinomial. All right, let's try one more, and then we'll start applying it into an equation. So here we got t squared plus 5t plus c. And again, we want to know, what is that c value? So in this particular case, b is equal to 5. And if we have our rule, b over 2 squared, well, that just means 5 over 2 squared. Now, we typically don't want a decimal. So what I'm going to do is, in order to square my fraction, I'm going to take that little 2 and I'm going to square the 5 and I'm going to square that 2. Well, 5 squared is 25 and 2 squared is 4. So c is going to be 25 over 4. And typically, we'll leave it in fraction form. So let's go ahead and take what we've learned and apply it to solving equations. So here's the first one that we have here. We got x squared minus 18x plus 5 is equal to negative 12. And I wrote out some steps here on the right. The first step that it asks us to do is to isolate the x squared and the x terms. So that means isolate means to get it by itself. Well, in order to get the x squared and the x term by itself, I got to get rid of this 5. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract 5. And what I do on one side, we got to do to the other. So that means the 5's on the left will cancel each other out, leaving us with our x squared minus 18x. We'll bring down the equal sign, and negative 12 minus 5 is negative 17. Well, the second step is to figure out what is that c value in order to make it a perfect square trinomial. And we know that that c value has that rule b over 2 squared. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do b over 2 squared. And that b value is this negative 18. So I'm going to go ahead and do negative 18, divide that by 2, and we're going to square it. Well, negative 18 divided by 2 is negative 9, and negative 9 squared is positive 81. Because negative times a negative is a positive. So we got a positive 81. Now, what I add on one side, I got to do to the other. So I'm going to add 81 on both sides. So this 81, I put it right over here, and I put it right over here. So now I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this equation here. So now my equation says x squared minus 18x plus 81 is now equal to, well, negative 17 plus 81 ends up being 64. Okay, so now that I added that c value to both sides, that 81, now we're going to solve the equation. Now to solve this equation, we're going to go ahead and write that perfect square trinomial in factored form. So I'm going to take this trinomial that we have here on the left, and we're going to write it in factored form. And like I said earlier, well, we could square the first term, we could square the last term, and then we take the sign in the middle. And because it's a perfect square trinomial, we'll square it. We'll bring down the equal sign, we'll bring down that 64. So now what we're going to do is we want to get x by itself, and to get x by itself, I got to get rid of that square, which means I got to do the square root. So what we do on one side, we'll do to the other. The square and the square roots will cancel each other out, leaving us with x minus 9 is now equal to, well, the square root of 64 is not just 8, but plus or minus 8. Because a positive 8 times a positive 8 is 64, and, well, a negative 8 times a negative 8 is also 64. So this is going to help us determine my two problems here. So we got two situations. The first one is where we have x minus 9 is now equal to the positive 8. So that's that plus sign, the positive 8. And then the second situation is x minus 9 is equal to the negative 8. So that's the minus sign. So now all we got to do is solve each one. So the first one, I'm just going to add 9 on both sides. X is equal to 17. On the other one, I'll add 9 on both sides. And x is equal to 1. So you can, depending on your teacher, leave it like that, or you may need to write it as a set of answers. And we typically write it in numerical order, so from least to greatest. So we'll say 1 and 17 are my two solutions. Okay, so let's go ahead and try another. So we got c squared minus 6c is equal to 7. And again, we're going to do the same thing here. Now, our c values are basically like my x values. So I want to isolate my c squared and my c. And they're already isolated. They're already by itself. So what I want to do is I want to take my complete the square by doing my rule b over 2 squared. Well, in this particular case, that b value is negative 6. So negative 6 over 2 squared. Well, negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. And negative 3 squared is going to give me 9. So I'm going to take that 9, and I'm going to substitute that 9, or I'm going to add that 9 to both sides. Okay, so now that we have this, we can write this out as c squared minus 6c plus 9 is now equal to 16. Okay, so now we have a perfect square trinomial on the left. And I know it's a perfect square trinomial because we completed the square. That's the whole purpose of completing the square. So now we're going to solve by factoring that perfect square trinomial. So I square root the first, square root the last. So that's going to be c and 3. Take the sign in the middle, which is the minus sign, and we square it. We bring down the equal sign, we bring down the 16. Now we're going to get rid of that square root sign by square sign by square rooting both sides. And the square root and the square will cancel each other out, leaving us with c minus 3 is now equal to plus or minus 4. Because a positive 4 times a positive 4 is 16, and a negative 4 times a negative 4 is also 16. So that's going to give us our two problems here. So the first one is c minus 3 is equal to our positive 4. And our second one is c minus 3 is equal to the negative 4. And remember, the positive and the negative is that plus or minus. So now we're just going to solve each one. The first one, we're going to add 3 on both sides. So c is equal to 7. We'll go ahead and add 3 on both sides to the second one, and c is negative 1. So once again, we could go ahead and write our answer in terms of a set. So c is going to be negative 1 and 7. All right. So let's go ahead and try one more. Let's take a look at this one. This one's slightly different here. And you'll see why once we start solving it. Once again, we want to isolate our x squared and our x, which it already is. And now we want to go ahead and complete the square. So if I want to complete the square here, I got my x squared plus 7x. So that 7 is my b value. So b over 2 squared. So that means 7 over 2 squared. Well, 7 divided by 2 doesn't give me a nice whole number. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and take that square and square to 7 and square to 2. Well, 7 squared is 49 and 2 squared is 4. So I got 49 over 4. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that 49 and that 4, and again, I'm going to add it to both sides here. So I'm going to add that 49 over 4 on the left, and I'm going to add 49 over 4 on the right. So when I go ahead and write this all out, on the left side, I'm just going to copy it. It says x squared plus 7x plus 49 over 4. But I need to combine that negative 12 with that 49 over 4. Well, to do that, I'm just going to have common denominators. I'm going to make it so that we have common denominators. And well, 12 is the same thing as 12 over 1, or negative 12 over 1 in this case. So what I want to do is I want to change that so that we have a 4 underneath, which means I got to multiply 4 over 4, which is 1. So negative 12 times 4 is going to be negative 48. So now I could go ahead and combine negative 48 and positive 49, and negative 48 plus 49 is going to give me 1, positive 1. And the denominator is still 4, so 1/4. All right, so this is not too bad. We can go ahead and do the same thing that we did before. We know on the left we have a perfect square trinomial because we completed the square. So I'm going to go ahead and square root the first one, which is x. Square root the last one, which means I do the square root of 49, which is 7, the square root of 4, which is 2. And then I go ahead and take the sign in the middle. We square it and bring down the equal sign and the 1/4. Okay, so now what we need to do is we want to get rid of that square. Well, to get rid of that square, we're going to go ahead and square root it. So we square root both sides. And that way the square and the square roots will cancel each other out, leaving us with x plus 7 over 2 is equal to plus or minus. Remember, anytime we do a square root, we have that plus or minus. Well, we square root the numerator, which is 1. We square root the denominator, which is 2. So the square root of 1 is 1, square root of 4 is 2. So now, here's our two problems. We'll go ahead and write it out. The first one, x plus 7 over 2 is now equal to positive 1 over 2. And our second equation, or our second problem, x plus 7 over 2 is equal to negative 1 over 2. Okay, so now we just need to go ahead and solve for x. So the first one, we'll subtract 7 over 2 on both sides. Okay, well, 1 minus 7 is going to give me negative 6, so negative 6 over 2. Well, negative 6 over 2 is equal to negative 3, so there's my first one. I'm going to go ahead and subtract 7 over 2 on both sides in the second one. Well, that's going to give me x is equal to negative 8 over 2. Negative 1 minus 7 is negative 8. Keep the denominator. And negative 8 over 2 is just negative 4. So we go ahead and write out our answer as a set. So our first one from least to greatest, always least to greatest, negative 4. And our second solution is negative 3. Oops, wrong one. Put in a little braces instead of a parentheses. And there's our solution. All right, I hope this helped in terms of completing the square and using it to help us solve equations. If you have any questions, comments, go ahead and leave a comment below and subscribe if you like. All right, I'll talk to you soon.